If you know someone who would love a peek behind the galley curtain and find out what crew really get up to, please make sure to share the Red Eye podcast. Airlines today employ a wonderfully diverse mix of crew. As long as you can pass the exams, both physical and mental, and you've got a half-decent personality, then you've got as much chance of getting the job as the Love Island contestant sat next to you at the interview, no matter how blessed or otherwise you are in the looks department. But it wasn't always like that. When I joined the airline back in the early 2000s and when Kaylee joined in the late 1990s, we were, if I say so myself, a pretty good-looking bunch. Nobody was overweight, although, to be fair, the days of mandatory weigh-ins had only just been scrapped, and there was a certain unspoken expectation that you'd be presentable, shall I say. In fact, part of the interview involved trying on the uniform, and I can't think of any reason for that, other than to check whether we looked the part. The boys were pretty handsome too, though. In truth, many of them were more interested in each other than the girls, if you catch my drift. But what about the ones who weren't? The charming, straight, good-looking lads with a preference for equally good-looking girls. Well, you'd think they were in heaven, wouldn't you? And you'd be right. Back then, a straight single guy was a rare commodity on the crew. Often the only one on the flight, and he had a captive audience and plenty of opportunities to charm. And let me tell you, charm they did. Some of us new crew fell hard and fast. Well, of course, not me. I was the very picture of professionalism on every layover. But my friends, well, let's just say that some of them might have had a story or two. And when this story came in, I was instantly taken back to those early days. Tight uniforms, long layovers, and the occasional broken heart.
Doors to armed and cross-check.
Come fly the red eye! Whoa!
Welcome aboard the Red Eye.
London to Los Angeles, circa 1999. Frances, or Fran to her friends, couldn't wait to get to Los Angeles. At just 22, it was the furthest she'd ever been from home. She was just old enough to legally drink in the States, and, judging by the crew chatter so far, this layover was shaping up to be unforgettable. "Fran, you coming to Hollywood tonight?" asked Simon, the purser, appearing beside her with a grin. "Yeah, sure. Where are we going?" Simon took the empty cart from her and casually rolled a fresh one in its place. Probably the Viper Rooms. He said it like they were just popping down to the local, but Fran nearly fell over. The Viper Rooms? She knew exactly what that meant. Celebrities, velvet ropes, scandal, and the kind of night out you told stories about for years. "Oh, count me in," she said, trying and failing to hide her excitement. "Great. I was hoping you'd come." Simon gave her a wink before disappearing down the aisle. Fran smiled, brow furrowing slightly as she pulled the cart into position. Had he been flirting with her all flight? Kind of felt like it. Little jokes, side comments, the way he always seemed to end up working beside her. Not that she was an expert anymore. She'd spent the last 4 years in a tiny studio flat in Manchester with Paul, her dependable, sweet, slightly boring boyfriend. The same one she'd met on the first night of Freshers' Week at uni. She hadn't so much as looked at another man since. Honestly, she wasn't even sure if she remembered how to flirt, let alone how to spot it. Still, as she handed out a tray to 43C with a grin, she let herself enjoy the moment. Paul was back in Manchester, proud as punch of her new job, always waiting with a takeaway when she got home. She knew how lucky she was. Some of the stories she'd heard on the jump seat made her relationship sound like a fairy tale. But still, who was she to turn down a little harmless flirting? And it didn't stop there. The whole night in Hollywood It was quite clear that Simon only had eyes for her. As the drinks flowed and the music played, it was in the darkness of the club that he bravely put his hand in the small of her back, out of sight of the rest of their crew. They kept the energy that was brewing just to themselves. It was no one else's business after all, but by the time they were back in the hotel, things had almost reached a point of no turning back. But Fran wasn't like that. Yes, she had succumbed to his charms and enjoyed the attention. Yes, if she was single, she might have gone further, but as the group piled into the lobby and Simon was temporarily distracted, she took the opportunity to jump in the first lift, reaching the sanctuary of her room before she did something bad. She breathed a sigh of relief as she sat on her bed, her head spinning slightly from all of the vodka she'd just drunk. The smile on her face was making her cheeks ache, but it wouldn't go away. It was a permanent fixture after the great night they had had. Aside from the attention from Simon, they had been to bars and clubs she had only read about. They'd walked in the footsteps of celebrities from the biggest movies, and for that night been a part of their world. For this girl from a little village in England, this job was a dream come true, and she still had to pinch herself that she was getting to live it. The room phone interrupted her daydream, and she reached over the bed to answer. Hello?
Hi, Fran, it's Simon. I was just wondering if you had a spare cigarette. I think I dropped mine in the cab.
Fran hesitated. She knew exactly what this was. She'd been warned of this tactic on other trips, but perhaps he did genuinely just want a cigarette. Sure, come round, she said, putting down the receiver. She stood up, her head spinning slightly, and checked herself in the mirror. The dress she'd bought last week in New York hugged every curve, and she had to admit she looked pretty good. Back home, Paul probably wouldn't even notice. They never went anywhere fancy together. They were more like friends in a flat share if she were honest with herself, and all passion had died out a long time ago, if it was even there in the first place. So, that feeling that she had right now, that one that was making her feel tingly all over, it seemed new. And she liked it. Fran answered the door and held it open to let Simon in. No words were exchanged. There was no need for them. London to Hong Kong, 6 months later. It would be okay, Fran kept telling herself, aware that her neck would be flushing bright red in that annoying way that it did when she felt like this. Whatever this was. Was she embarrassed? No, she didn't need to be embarrassed. Nervous? Oh, maybe, but she wasn't sure. Whatever it was, having Simon Harper, the one who she'd spent 2 nights in Los Angeles with, showing off her best bedroom gymnastics skills, brief the crew as if he had never met a single one of them before, was throwing her inner balance alarmingly off-centre. She loosened her scarf to let some air to her neck. At the front of the room, Simon sat next to the manager, his legs crossed and leaning back so casually as he briefed them on tonight's service to Hong Kong. It was Christmas Day when they arrived, and Fran had been pleased to see it on her roster, thinking it would be good for her after finally breaking up with Paul. But she hadn't seen the crew list until this morning, and now she was having serious doubts it would do her any good at all. You can do this, she told herself firmly as he prattled on about checking toilets and answering call bells. After their trip, he'd ignored her calls, and then, when they'd been in New York at the same time the following month, while he had been civil, it was as if nothing had ever happened between them. He'd fobbed her off with easy conversation and claims that he needed an early night, and she'd been humiliated. It wasn't until after that she learned of his reputation with the new girls and realised she'd been an absolute mug. She studied him. He was a few years older than her, maybe more, and if she wasn't wrong, his hair was starting to recede, wasn't it? He didn't have a strong jaw or broad shoulders like she would normally like. In fact, he really wasn't all that if you took away his charm and cheeky nature. But knowing what she knew about him now, they had faded too. No, she thought with a tiny shake of her head. She'd had a close escape. He'd given her the push she needed to leave Paul, but would she really have wanted to be saddled with Simon Harper as her next boyfriend? He said something and the whole room was laughing, and there it was, that grin. Her stomach sunk. Maybe she would have, but it wasn't to be, and so there was no point in dwelling on it. No point whatsoever. And anyway, he'd had a small willy, she thought, making herself laugh and feel better immediately. Simon Harper, with all of his confidence and charisma, had a small willy, and he knew that she knew it. Anyone want another beer? The captain was standing at the front of the bus. It was tradition here that the pilots bought beers at the 7-Eleven in the airport for the journey to the hotel, and after what she had just seen, Fran shot her hand up without a moment's hesitation. She had seen little of Simon on the way over. He'd been working at the front while she was at the back, and they'd been on separate breaks, so the flight had actually been fine. She hadn't been expecting the show of affection between him and Jane at the end, though. The kiss at the baggage carousel, the sitting next to each other on the bus. By all accounts, the pair of them had been in a relationship for years. Someone had filled her in when she'd questioned it. And that had bothered her more than it should have. Who knew? Fran huffed as she poured the Qingtao down her neck. Who knew that I was that unspecial I was just another shag on the side? And, she looked back at them, she wasn't prettier, wittier, more interesting. Not from what she'd seen, anyway. Yeah, she said, a smile tugging at her lips, replacing her momentary indignation. Mario grinned. You looked seriously pissed off just then. Fran laughed. Oh, I was just thinking about something. So, she turned to face him, are we going straight out? Of course, smiled Mario, shimmying with his shoulders and making his head boppers jingle. It's Christmas, baby. Hong Kong in the late 1990s was a wild place, full of expats and airline crews. The cobbled hills of Lan Kwai Fong were filled with people from all over the world. In today's terms, it was a vibe, and it was not a place to hang on to grudges. Fran had seen him, Simon, watching her as she spun around that pole on the bar. Oh yeah, she had his number, playing all doting boyfriend to Jane with the mousy hair, while deep down, he clearly wanted her, and she knew it. As the daiquiris and tequila shots flowed, the smiles got wider, the music got louder, and Fran got better. Better at dancing, better at singing, better at air guitar. Oh yeah, she was every man's dream, and as she shimmied past Simon to the dance floor with a 6-foot blonde Norwegian cargo pilot in tow, she was certain he knew just exactly what he was missing. As said pilot spun her around on the dance floor, she threw a look over in his direction, where he stood at the bar, alone with his girlfriend, and she felt amazing. Look at what you could have been having, she yelled inside, throwing her head back as she spun again. Her short skirt had ridden up her legs, but she had long since stopped pulling it down. No, she had great legs, and she was not afraid to show them off. And she really could dance. She spun again, over and over, wanting him to see, wanting them all to see how great her dancing was, until... What was that? A strange feeling made her stop dancing as she tried to work out what it was. With the sudden stop, her head kept spinning, and her stomach... Oh no. Oh shit. She was going to throw up. She looked at her dancing partner, who was still grinding and grinning at her, and she felt the horror consume her. "Oh, I'm going to be back in a sec." She squeezed past the others on the dance floor, but where were the toilets? She remembered they were at the back. Oh no, she'd never make it. She desperately scanned the area, feeling the shaken contents of her stomach rising up. The beer, the cocktails, oh, the tequila. She threw a hand to her mouth and ran to the only thing she could see. The plant pot just outside. The one right next to the bar. Right next to Simon and Jane. Oh, and did she vomit? Deep, muscle-straining wrenches over and over as everyone at the bar watched on. And there was worse. As she struggled to stop the tide of sick, the strain didn't just pull on her stomach. Oh no. As each gush of vomit poured into the plat pot, a loud puff of air left her bottom, and her breast popped out of her low-cut top. And then, as her body heaved even harder, brought up even more regurgitated alcohol, another liquid poured out from under her short skirt. A warm stream of urine began steadily running across the cobbles away from her and down the hill. She could hear the shrieks as people moved out of its way, knew that this was, and probably always would be, the most humiliating moment of her life. But there was nothing she could do about it, but stay here and carry on hurling into a pot until she had nothing more to give. And she knew that Simon was watching, probably thinking that he'd made the positively right decision not having a second date with her. Oh, love, you poor thing. Between heaves, Frances looked up to see who had been brave enough to come so close. Who had ignored the trail of piss and stench of vomit to come over and rub her back, shield her from the onlookers. It was Jane. Until now, her competition. The one who Simon had chosen over her. Here she was, the only one of her crew to come to her aid, while the others, well, who knew what they were doing? She felt Jane put a jacket over her shoulders. She hadn't realised that she'd been cold until then, and as she stood up, slowly tucking her breasts back into her top as she did, she realised that she was shivering. "Here," Jane said, handing her a clean tissue. Fran took it, wiping the vomit from her lips. She couldn't look up. Didn't want to know who had seen. "Oh, I think I'd better get a cab home," she mumbled, accepting that her dancing was over for the night. "I'll come with you." Jane looked over her shoulder and called out to Simon. "I'll be back in 30. Just going to get Fran back safely." Fran wanted to argue, wanted to tell her to stay, that she'd be okay, but truth was, she wasn't sure if getting back to the hotel was within her capabilities right then. What if she needed to be sick again? What if... She looked at Jane and was quite sure that she had a halo over her head. This girl, who didn't know that she'd slept with her boyfriend, who she had barely spoken to on the flight over, was taking time out of her own night to get her back to her room, to look after her and make sure she was okay. This girl was an angel, and she owed her big time. At the hotel, Jane lowered Fran onto her bed, put a glass of water beside her and an empty waste bin on the floor next to her in case she needed to vomit again. "Now, make sure you sleep on your side, girlie," she said as she left. "I'm so sorry," Fran mumbled. "Oh, don't be daft," Jane said brightly. "We've all been there." She blew her a kiss as she left and pulled the door closed behind her, hanging the Do Not Disturb sign on the outside. Fran pulled the sheet over her head, shutting out her shame. It was no wonder Simon had preferred her, was it? She bet he was thanking his lucky stars that he had made the choices he had right now. 2 days later, still carrying the weight of her shame like excess baggage, Fran boarded the flight home. She smiled when expected, nodded in the right places, did her best to act as though nothing had happened, but she could feel it in every glance, every too kind smile from the crew. They all knew. And worse, she knew they'd remember it longer than she ever wanted to. The first service flew by in a blur of clattering trays and polite routine. Soon, the cabin lights were dimmed, the passengers asleep, and half the crew had disappeared into the belly of the A340-600 to rest. Fran was on second break. She moved through the darkened cabin, torchlight dancing ahead of her as she weaved around slack limbs and tangled headset cords. When she reached the front, she was surprised to find Jane sat on the jump seat flicking through the pages of a magazine. "Babe, come sit down," she said, far too cheerfully for the ungodly hour, pulling down the jump seat next to her. Fran dropped into it. "I'd better not stay long. There's only 2 of them down the back." Truth was, she hadn't been alone with Jane since she'd tucked her drunken body into bed 2 nights ago, and she wasn't quite ready for that conversation. Not here. Not ever if she could help it. "Oh, they'll cope. Everyone's asleep. Anyway, what do you think of this dress?" She angled the magazine toward Fran, who glanced down and froze, horrified to see that it was a wedding dress. Are you getting married? To Simon?" "Oh, well, don't look too pleased for me," Jane grinned. Fran forced a smile onto her face. "Sorry, I'm just surprised, that's all. You never mentioned it before." She had a sudden, overwhelming urge to tell her that her boyfriend was a lying cheat, but she stopped herself. She didn't deserve that. Not right now. Not like this. "Yeah, next month. It's all booked." Jane flew into a detailed explanation of every minute detail of the day, while Fran bit down hard on her tongue. And then it got worse. He's so perfect, you know? Jane was simpering now. "He treats me like a queen, and well..." She gave a small giggle and leaned in closer. "He's amazing in bed." Fran blinked, and Jane laughed again, stretching her hands apart, whispering, "He has a huge cock." "Oh!" It was all that Fran could manage, her mouth opening in shock at the blatant lie. Simon Harper did not have a huge cock. Simon Harper's cock was far from huge. In fact, it was the smallest she had ever seen. So why did Jane just sit there and lie to her about it? Why? Was it love? Was it denial? Or had she just never known any better? At that exact moment, the curtain swished aside, and a sleepy Simon stumbled through. He rubbed his eyes as he looked at the 2 of them. He didn't even look worried that she might have dropped him in it. Fran stood up. "Oh, here, you can have my seat. I'm off," she said flatly. "The wedding is going to be great." And with that, she left the galley. Suddenly, all the feelings of being the underdog left her. These 2 were nuts, and they were welcome to each other. Let them have each other. Simon with his fading good looks and inflated ego. Jane so relentlessly lovely it bordered on delusion. They'd go on lying to each other, smiling through it, pretending it all made sense. No, she was sure that her shame would lift once she was off this flight. They would go off to married life with all their lies, and her, well, she would get back to looking for Mr. Right. And maybe, just maybe, she'd lay off the tequila. Huge, she muttered under her breath as she stepped over a leg in the aisle, rolling her eyes to the ceiling. Huge my arse. And just like that, the weight lifted. If only a little. The Red Eye podcast is written by Kaylee Kay, narrated and produced by me, Ali Murphy. These stories are based on true events, but certain details, characters, and timelines have been altered to protect the innocent. Visit our website, theredeyepod.com, to subscribe to our newsletter and to find out details on how you can contribute your story for us to turn into an episode. If you enjoyed listening to our stories, please like, subscribe, and review. Thank you. Our author, Kaylee Kay, does an incredible job of taking these true stories and turning them into fun little episodes for the Red Eye podcast. But did you know she's already written 6 novels, and they are amazing? So if you want to read those, visit Amazon and search for Kaylee Kay, and I'll put a link in the show notes too.